Ritsa Panagiotou, who has written an article for a journal on the impact of the global economic crisis on the Western Balkans. Maybe you can outline to us the different waves of the crisis and how they've impacted the Western Balkans differently, as you argue in your article.
Yes, yes. The structure of the article is specific. It's in three sections, as it shows in the introduction. The first section is the first wave of the crisis, which is the global economic crisis, which was also a European crisis. And then the second wave is the Greek crisis and how that impacts the region. And the third section of the paper is how these sequential crises, and which add one upon the other, affect not only the Balkan region's economies, but their accession prospects, because that's the whole essence of what I'm interested in, how the economic crisis affects the Western Balkans' EU accession prospects. So the first wave is roughly indicated to start in the last quarter of 2008. And as I say in the paper, it reversed most of the progress that had been achieved in the previous 5 years, because the period 2003-2007 and a little bit of 2008 was a period of great growth for the region after a very turbulent decade of the 90s, of course. There was a macroeconomic growth, on average 6% a year, which is tremendous for the region. Tremendous influx of foreign direct investment. Remittances were coming back into the region from the West European countries where these citizens were working. There was tremendous activity in the financial sector. So the period 2003-2007 was quite a significant growth. And then when the crisis hit in late 2008, slowly, and then more accelerated in 2009, this progress started being reversed. In 2009, there was a sharp contraction in GDP. Foreign direct investment flows contracted. Remittances started dwindling, etc. So this was the first big shock, because the greatest partners in terms of trade and investment of the Western Balkan countries are the countries in the European Union. But then the second wave, which as far as I'm concerned was much more dramatic and is still in progress, was the Greek crisis. And this is what I refer to as the second wave of the crisis, because these countries are very strongly interlinked with the Greek economy on a trade level, very much in an investment level, tremendous remittances. There were about 600,000 Albanians, for example, living and working in Greece. So the amount of remittances they were sending back was a very significant contribution. Some estimates even say up to 8% of Albania's GDP came from remittances from Greece. And then a tremendous involvement in the banking sector of these countries, including Bulgaria and Romania, as I say. And even though they are EU countries since 2007, when the crisis hits them, it trickles into the other countries as well. So the tremendous impact of the Greek crisis, especially from 2010, 2011, it has been tremendously negative, because all these figures started contracting again. Trade figures, investment figures, remittances, and banking sector have been very negatively affected. And so that's the description, briefly, discussion on the actual waves of the crisis, how they impact, and then we analyze, of course, the various levels, macro, finance, etc. And then we proceed to see how all this affects their EU prospects.
So tell me, I mean, you're exploring basically how the convergence narrative is no longer working. So what do you mean with that? I mean, how do you make sense of that? So the convergence narrative, where does it stand? Does it mean that the region is kind of stuck in being less developed than the rest of the European Union, or what is this crisis telling us about this?
Yeah, stuck in the periphery of the periphery, as Dimitar Bechev coined the phrase, which I think is extremely appropriate. Yes, the convergence narrative, now this is a term that is used quite a bit in the literature, because essentially what it's referring to is the fact that the EU is considered a one-way ticket, so to speak, a one-way path to stability and prosperity and consolidation of democracy. And there were case studies of Greece, Spain, and Portugal as they consolidated democracy. These countries using membership in the EU to consolidate and converge towards the EU standard. And this was expected to be the case for the newer members in 2004 as well, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, etc., and was hoped to be the case with Bulgaria, Romania, and then the future countries. So the whole narrative was like, we work towards joining the EU, and then we continue our convergence within the framework of the EU structures. And this narrative, as I say, has been dealt a very serious blow because of the Greek crisis, in the sense that the Greek crisis showed that it is not necessarily a one-way path to stability and security. And if you do not continue to do the work and follow the rules and live up to the standards of the EU and not just be a recipient of the goodness of the EU, you can just as quickly become a pariah, be left in the periphery of the periphery, which is geographical periphery. And unfortunately, the case of Greece is sustained also, or the convergence narrative is also weakened by what happened in Portugal and Spain close behind, but not quite so bad. Meaning that the whole European South, the crisis in the whole European South shows that maybe this convergence narrative, the Greek case is the worst, of course, but maybe it's not really as powerful as we thought originally. And then there are also issues of solidarity within the European Union, because the Greek perspective was that the Greeks received too much criticism, unfair sometimes, fair sometimes, etc. So from the Western Balkan perspective, they looked with horror at what was happening in Greece, because they thought, oh my goodness, this was a country that we, for better or for worse, considered a successful case of converging towards the European model. And look what's happening to them, practically and psychologically, in the sense that Greece became a pariah within the EU. And this looks very bad from the Western Balkan perspective.
So what does that mean for the enlargement dynamics in the Western Balkans? Because large part, of course, of the promise of EU membership was always the promise of greater economic prosperity. And that offer on the table no longer seems to be there, based on what you've been exploring in your article.
Yeah, it's not quite that it's no longer there, but it's definitely made a lot more difficult. Because I think everybody who studies enlargement sees that almost every round is more and more difficult. The criteria are getting more and more stringent. There's even a clause that this is not a guaranteed process, that it does not necessarily mean that you will join the EU. It will take as long as it takes. And Croatia, that just joined 7 months ago, was considered one of the stronger candidates, and even that took, I think, about 10 years. So already we have a slowing down of the enlargement process. I think there's no question that this enlargement fatigue, that because of the unprecedented enlargements of 2004 and 2007, has been made even worse by the crisis. The crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and the Greek crisis, of course, first and foremost. And it's been made even worse because, first of all, when the economies of the EU are in such bad state, the last thing they want to think of is enlargement to more problematic states. And enlargement fatigue also shows in the polls. The Eurobarometer, the most recent poll, showed around 32% of EU citizens support further enlargement. Now that's a very low percentage, and some countries like France, that are arguably one of the more dominant countries in the EU, have a 28% or 29% approval of further enlargement. Then you have Poland with 62%, for example, but so Germany, I think 31%, Austria is extremely low as well. So this enlargement fatigue is showing in the EU population as well. There's so much austerity going on, some countries more than others, Greece very much, Portugal, Ireland, but other countries are under austerity as well. And the thought of having to support weaker countries and enlarge, it just seems unimaginable at this point. And then I also mentioned in the paper, though, how enlargement fatigue is balanced or juxtaposed, to say, by evaluation fatigue on the Western Balkan sides. side. And I can relate to that as well, being under IMF supervision in Greece. It is extremely tiresome to be constantly under evaluation. If you're doing enough, do you fulfill the criteria? Have you done the checklist? And it goes down. So the Western Balkan countries are also getting disenchanted with the whole accession process because they see the process as being more and more remote, the prospects of joining. And so this is a very dangerous precedent, I think, in the Balkan region, because one could say many things about the process of EU enlargement, but what one cannot deny that it has been an anchor of stability for the Western Balkans. The prospects of joining the EU have been a motor for reform, economic and political reform. And if this prospect seems more and more remote, the prospect of joining the EU, that bodes very unwell, I would say, for the region.
Mm-hmm.
And so this has serious implications for the whole region, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Ritsa, so much. I think this is exactly, what you're outlining in the article is a certain way the crisis was imported into the region from outside. It will take the region longer to overcome it in many ways than the EU member states, because it's very much in a certain way subject to improvement, economic improvement there. But the repercussions, the political repercussions you also outline in your article, are quite severe. So I think this is in a certain way, a gloomy, but yet also showing that links between EU enlargement and the political economy of the countries. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and one last point, just for the specificity of the Greek case, is that, as I mentioned in the article, that the region, and this is a tremendously negative implication for the enlargement process, the region lost an ambassador to Brussels, as I say, because Greece, for better or for worse, had taken over the role of being a spokesman in Brussels for the Balkan region. It was considered a successful consolidation of democracy example, as we said in the Convergence Narrative. And with the Agenda 2014 and through the Thessaloniki Summit of 2003, it was the first time that the Western Balkans were given a specific agenda for joining the Union. And this now has all been turned on its head, because Greece is no longer seriously considered an ambassador of the region. If anything, one would say the opposite. It's considered a negative precedent. And so the region has lost its success story that could speak for it in Brussels. And this is extremely negative repercussion of the whole crisis, and the Greek crisis especially, for the Balkan region. It has sort of discredited the region. Mm-hmm. So this was actually my final conclusion in the paper, that the implications are, you have the tangible negative repercussions, which are the macroeconomic, the financial, investment, etc. And then you have the intangible, which is exactly the discreditation of the region, enlargement fatigue, evaluation fatigue, losing the ambassador to Brussels, etc. So all this paints, unfortunately, quite a gloomy picture for imminent enlargement. But hopefully, we will soon be out of the crisis in Greece, and hopefully we'll bring the region with us. That's all I can say.
Indeed, Ritsa, thank you so much. Every crisis will come to an end, although the peoples of the Western Balkans have experienced more crisis than normality in the last 30, 40 years.
More than their share.
Indeed,
yes.
So there will be an end point to that at some point. We just don't know yet exactly when.
Soon.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts for us and contributing the article.
Thank you, Florian. Bye.